So, is this on, Jess? Okay. So maybe we can begin. Obviously, we'd like to welcome you all to the ODI and, of course, welcome the IMF as well. The topic today is a report, Macroeconomic Development and Prospects in Low-Income Countries. This is the second year that the ODI has hosted a presentation of this report. And last year it was quite a long-term look at structural trends within LICs. And this year's report is slightly different. It's much short-term prospects, but also more forward-looking. And of course, we're looking in between those reports as well. The environment for LICs has really changed very significantly. Obviously, Sean will talk about it a little bit, but I think it's fair to say it's a much more negative and difficult environment than it has been certainly 2 years ago and even a year ago. So that will be the focus for much of the presentation today. Let me introduce our speakers and our panel. First of all, we have Sean Noland, who is the Deputy Director in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department at the IMF. Sean has been with the IMF since 1992 in quite a wide variety of roles. And that includes, as well, with the IMF and others, some personal experience in developing countries. He's worked in the Philippines, in South Africa, and I want to say, in Indonesia as well. Then we have Stefania Fabrizio, who works as Deputy Unit Chief also in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department. She has worked in the European and in the African departments and is a specialist in those areas, and in particular looks at public expenditure and fiscal expenditure and related issues. We've got two discussants here today. We have Ahmed Ahmad, who is a lecturer from Loughborough, specialising in macroeconomics and including financial aspects of macroeconomics. Ahmed is also my new colleague on a large grant we just won from the UK's Economic Research and Social Council for a 4-year project looking at financial sector development in LICs. So I'm very pleased to meet my new colleague. We've just co-investigators. And last but not least, my colleague at the ODI, Elizabeth Stewart. Liz is also a research fellow, as I'm myself at the ODI. She leads our team on sustainable development goals and has also previously worked for Oxfam and for Save the Children. And she will be focusing particularly on the SDGs in her commentary today. So, Sean, on that, just the running order, Sean and Stefania are going to make the presentation. It should take about 40 minutes. We'll then have the two discussants, and then we'll be taking questions both from the audience and online. Okay, so, Sean, over to you.
Judith, thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. As Judith mentions, this is the second time that ODI has hosted this presentation, this particular paper. It's also only the second time we've produced it. We decided about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, that it would be a desirable thing for the IMF to produce an annual report on macroeconomic developments in low-income countries. Basically leveraging off the fact that we have the World Economic Outlook, we have an elaborate database, we have an entire story about the global economy, accuracy issues aside, and this whole package is integrated, and it seemed sensible to say, let's carve out low-income countries as a group and look at it with a magnifying glass, if you like. Most of the discussion prior to that has always been of the developing countries as a big block, emerging market and developing economies. But if you're talking about an aggregate that includes Turkey and Liberia, you're kind of not talking about a useful aggregate at all. So we focused on defining low-income developing countries. And the easiest way to think of them basically is IDA eligible economies that are not don't have access to markets. IDA eligible, leaving out basically India and Pakistan. It's a group of 60 countries, which we're going to hold constant for about 5 years, because if you start changing the definition every year, then you have the problems of telling coherent stories over time. And so that's 2/3 of our presentation. This is where I'm going to show that I'm very much a 20th century person. People actually tell me that I flatter myself in saying that I'm a 20th century person, but that's a separate topic. We want to touch on two things, actually. The first one is the report itself, which has 3 segments to it, and I'll cover segment 1, and Stefania will cover segments 2 and 3, B and C. But we also want to talk to you about the paper the IMF produced last year on financing for development. And we want to actually discuss with you what the IMF committed as deliverables. And one of the reasons we want you to do that is we want you to be aware of the deliverables and actually to ask questions in about 6 and 9 months' time about where are the deliverables. So there's an effort to pre-commit to ensuring we deliver. But we gave a lot of thought last year to it. I'll touch upon that as the last part of the presentation. So thank you. Let me go on. When I mentioned low-income developing countries, I'm talking about 60 countries that would, the biggest of which would be Nigeria and Vietnam. About 1.3 billion people, as I said, income per capita below 2,500, leaving aside India and Pakistan. I don't have to convince anybody in this room that this category of country is an economic structure and that is very different from those of the emerging markets of the $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to $10,000 per capita income. Higher agricultural, much larger agricultural sectors, lower levels of financial development, etc. We have found it useful to divide the group of countries by two categories. One is by level of financial development, where we, in a sense, are taking, and we tease out, we have one group of frontier markets, a second is fragile states, and then the third group is the residual developing countries as a whole. That makes particular sense actually for medium-term analysis because the fragile state story is always going to be very different from the others. And this time around, for reasons that will be obvious in about 2 slides' time, we've also found it useful to split the group into commodity exporters and diversified exporters. Now, commodity exporters here means countries that export more than 50% of their exports of goods and services come from commodities. The diversified exporters, diversified is just a word we came up with. Some countries you would not describe Bangladesh as a diversified exporter in the sense of you'd say garments, but it's certainly not a commodity exporter. So diversified exporters here means simply not a commodity exporter, rather than the idea of a very elaborate and rich export mix. That's not the idea. It's just not dependent on commodities. So this is the sort of set of countries we're describing. 60% in about 57% of the countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, 43% are elsewhere. The bigger ones being in Asia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Vietnam, for example. Let me kick off. I want you in this slide to look actually at the broken lines initially, because the broken lines are what the forecasts were from the World Economic Outlook in October 2014. And the striking story from 2011 through to 2014 was forget 2010 because there's very high growth in 2010. There's a huge rebound from 2009. It's kind of a statistical phenomenon rather than anything else. You had an increasingly sluggish global growth, yet when you looked at the low-income countries, they were doing very well. Growth was proceeding at a much, much higher pace. And this was the thing this was Africa rising and various other sort of themes that were floating around. And the dotted line continuing into the distance showed what the expectations were. That's maybe 18 months ago. And so what's changed? Well, the world economy has been a little bit more sluggish than was envisaged, but the differences are like the 0.3, 0.4% of GDP. They're not large differences. But you can see the growth levels in low-income countries have really fallen very, very sharply. And why is that? What's different? If the world economy is doing okay, what's gone wrong for low-income countries? And that becomes clear from the next slide. Again, the broken lines show the forecasts for commodity prices in October 2014. You can see the petroleum price. Both of them were expected to decline very gradually, but we've seen actually a very sharp decline rather than gradual decline. A precipitous drop in oil prices, but also a fairly sizable drop in non-fuel prices as well. So what's changed from 18 months ago is not so much the fact that the world economy is growing more slowly. It is, but that's a second-order factor. It's the fact that commodity prices have tanked so dramatically. Now, we wanted to look at how important is this? The first thing we need to remember is that we think commodity prices, or developing countries, they're all commodity exporters. But of course, that's far too simplistic. And many of them also, their biggest import item, for example, is oil. So we said to ourselves, how do we identify the winners and the losers? Those who've gained from the big terms of trade shock and those who've lost. And not too surprised. What this shows here is using a simple index. It covers 33 commodities. It's the pure income effect. It's, if you like, P1 minus P0 times the amount of exports, the quantity, as a share of GDP. And that's across all 33 commodities. The green bar shows the price change from June to June, and then the brown bar shows it from June to December 2015. But these are annual income losses, if you like. Just the prices differ across the two indicators. And as you see, for oil exporters, of course, it's a monumentally disastrous income effect. For non-oil exporters, it's second order. The income effect is second order. And then for diversified exporters, the actual gains from things like the collapse of oil prices are actually produce a favorable terms of trade, income shock, actually. And if you went to individual products, you would see the story more of individual countries. You can see countries, Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Ghana are countries where oil is important. You're getting significant effects there. If you look at somewhere like Ethiopia and say, how has Ethiopia lost? The answer is, of course, really through the oil price and the other commodity import prices gained very, very significantly. So big point number one here is winners versus losers, and remembering that there's a fair number of winners and a fair number of losers. Second point is that the analysis I've just given you is too simplistic, because all we've looked at is the income effect, the pure income effect. And there are at least three different effects that you want to focus on as well, and they vary definitively by country, by product, by sector, in ways that you will actually be able to work out for yourself. Firstly, there's direct supply response of existing producers to the fall in prices. That affects exports and it affects employment. Think oil, and actually the volume response is actually not very significant. If you wanted to think of copper in Zambia, you'd be getting really big employment effects actually from the fall in copper, because you would be getting significant output effects and associated employment effects. And you also get big in smaller countries, you get big 0-1 effects, discrete jumps. Sierra Leone's a good example. It's where the mining sector closes down. So actually, you can be talking about a terms of trade game, but the entire sector is shut. So the teasing out the supply responses, actually, you have to know the sector, and it can vary quite. It can be big or it can be small, depending on the factors I've just mentioned. The investment response is the impact on new projects, which can be quite sizable. And the last one is an important point that's also easy to forget, which is the income distribution effect. There's a big income lost coming from the fall in prices, as we mentioned. But who's losing? I mean, if all the loss is untaxed multinationals, then, and there's no volume effect, actually almost the entire loss is being borne by foreign shareholders, and we will not weep for that. Whereas on the other hand, if you have a pretty good tax regime in place and you're taking 60 cents out of every extra dollar on a barrel of oil, then the income distribution effect of the oil price loss on, say, the Nigerian economy, for example, is much different, because the budget's suddenly taking a huge hit. So I think in any individual country case, you've got to think through each of these factors as well as the pure income effect. So that's the way in which commodity prices have kicked in to affect countries in different ways. What do we get out of that in terms of the growth story? As Judith mentioned, last year we looked over 15-year trends. And we did that partly actually because if you looked at the short-term macro over the preceding 2 years, it would have been a really boring story. You wouldn't have had much to say. The last 18 months have been anything but boring. What's striking in this diagram, the boxes show October 2015 forecasts. The green dots show January 2016 updates. What's strikingly clear is for diversified exporters, the effect of all the shocks on balance is basically not very significant. It doesn't really matter very much. Whereas for the commodity exporters, the effects are quite marked. And I think the growth projections are probably a little bit optimistic as well going forward. I think we don't own these numbers, by the way. These are all produced by country teams. So if a country team tells you their forecast, you run with it. But there often seems to be a sluggish sort of modification to forecasts at times. So the bottom line is who's winning, who's losing. The exporters, the diversified exporters are doing okay, haven't been really hit, and the commodity exporters have been hit significantly. We could go through individual parts of the how the different parts of the fiscal sector, external sector have been hit. I'm going to go through it really lightly. It's covered in some detail in the paper, and a lot of the stories are nuanced. And so rather than bore you by going up and down across a load of different countries, I'm going to actually just go over this quite lightly. But you're seeing on the fiscal side, we split it again by commodity exporters and diversified exporters. Unsurprisingly, for the exporters, you're seeing a big hit to the budget, and typically from the loss of tax revenues of some form or another. On the diversified exporters, you're seeing weakening fiscal positions, but part of that is a scaling up story. Part of that is energy revenues declining and accruing to the state. SOE revenues in Myanmar. There's a mixture of stories there. The public debt is on the picture, is on the gradual upward movement in the public debt story. But let me pass, rather than discuss it in detail, let me go to the external story, which is, again, commodity exporter story is not going to surprise you too much, big deterioration in current account positions. But again, when you look at individual countries, you begin to realize it's so much trickier than looking at developed economies or advanced economies, because if you look at Mozambique, which has been hit adversely by price shocks, the current accounts improved quite significantly. Now, why is it improved quite significantly? The answer is, of course, big projects that sort of commenced X years ago are now coming on stream. So you're actually suddenly seeing in the current account large amounts of exports materializing. So the counterintuitive result, when you think about it down to the level of individual sectors, which is usually what you have to do in particularly in commodity-dependent economies, makes sense. It makes sense for the sectoral level, but it doesn't make sense from the standard macro story of what should be happening to the current account in a downturn. On the right-hand side, there are the developments in external debt, which are gradually drifting upwards. We produced a paper in November on public debt vulnerabilities in low-income countries, which reviews trends in debt burdens and concerns about levels of debt distress in developing countries, which was mainly backward-looking. I was covering the period 2007, 2014. Stefania will comment a little bit on what's happening to our debt sustainability assessments as we look forward, because they're looking outwards 10, 15 years. As to are there new debt distress problems emerging? Again, if you look at the diversified exporters, you're saying why are current account positions deteriorating there? And it's actually, again, they're idiosyncratic factors. The deterioration's heavily concentrated in Vietnam, Myanmar, and Ethiopia, and a lot of it is an investment story. For most of the other large diversified exporters, there really isn't very much of a story about changing in the current account position. So rather than, let me not use up too much of my time here. The last piece of the external side that I wanted to mention is what's happened to foreign reserves and what's happened to spreads. The left-hand side panel only talks about commodity exporters. I have no information on commodity diversified exporters, actually, because there's no story. The reserve patterns aren't really evolving. They're not changing over time, so it didn't warrant a panel. And what you're seeing here is kind of predictable, which is that if you split the audience, the group of countries into floating exchange rate countries and fixed rate countries, reserves are taking much more of a hit in the fixed rate case than they are in the floating rate case. Zambia is a good example, I think, of a country where it really has allowed the external shock feed through the exchange rate rather than seeking to defend it. Other countries have gone to some lengths to defend exchange rates, whether they're formally fixed or not. On the right-hand side is the sovereign spreads, what's happened to them 2013, 2014, and now. The pointers, the little triangles you can see at the top are the now numbers. what's I think I'd draw your attention to in the picture is to firstly look at Bolivia and Vietnam, which are numbers 1 and 3, looking at it from the left. And the answer is actually nothing's happened at all. And why is that? Well, the answer in some senses is the core macro fundamentals of the economies haven't changed significantly. In the Bolivian case, there's a big energy effect, but they've huge stabilization fund that so their spreads haven't changed very much. By contrast, if you look at Ghana is the example that I think sticks out for many of us, is there you're seeing a really big increase over time in spreads. Ghana actually recently did a bond issue, $1 billion, with a partial guarantee from the World Bank, and it still was 10.75% interest rate, which in a world of $0 inflation is an interest rate that is really very troublingly high. So that's the rough story on reserve positions and on funding costs. This is just a brief summary on currencies. Again, remember about half of low-income countries are actually adopt fixed exchange rates. Some of them say in the context of West Africa as part of monetary unions. So this only picks on a small group of countries where currencies are flexible. One of the big message out of when you look at the numbers actually is there's quite countries where the exchange rates move quite a lot. The pass through into domestic inflation in most cases is quite limited. Inflation is not a problem in almost all low-income countries. Malawi and Ghana are exceptions, but they're exceptions because Malawi is a good example of being in significant financial stress for an extended period of time. The exchange rates tanked, et cetera. So with the very few exceptions, inflation is just not an interesting issue, which is an enormous change if you think from say looking back to the 1980s or 90s. Any other points I want to wrap up on there? Just in terms of engagement with the IMF, we're seeing a pick up in the number of countries engaging and entering into program relations with us. The two big programs of 2015 were a program with Ghana and a program with Kenya. The Kenya program is an interesting one. The Ghana one is a stabilization program because you've had major fiscal problems. It's the old story in a sense of a large-scale fiscal adjustment. The Kenya program was interesting in that it's a precautionary arrangement, and it was really intended to provide the Kenyans with a degree of sort of a financial safety net in the case they encountered significant turbulence in international financial markets. Looking ahead, we would expect to see more programs in the year ahead, but no particular clear numbers that I could cite at this point in time. I just want to draw 3 messages from this before stopping, and none of them are rocket science, but they sort of hit you over the head when you work your way through the numbers. Dirk didn't agree with me today, but there's a strong consensus that commodity prices are unlikely to rebound, in the sense we're not going to see $80 a barrel, and governments that wait on the hope that they're going to be back to $80 or $90 a barrel in a year or 2 years' time are going to end up in significant problems. So in a sense, the core policy message is this one looks like it's here to stay, and therefore you need to adjust to the new unpleasant realities and unpleasant arithmetic of much lower export revenues and tax revenues. A second classic IMF point is the idea, of course, that it's a reminder that if you have built macroeconomic policy space to handle like shocks, they can be handled much more smoothly. Nigeria in 2008, 9, 10 is a good example, because a lot of oil money was saved between 2004 and 2008. So if you look at Nigerian growth through 2008, 9, 10, 11, it's basically unchanged. Reserves fall because, of course, the oil prices collapse, but then it rebounds. Nigeria now does not have the same sort of kind of exchange rate, foreign reserve levels, and therefore doesn't have the macroeconomic policy space, which sharply constricts the amount of room that policymakers have to handle the shocks. And the last point I'll make before handing over to Stefania is a point that, say, many people in this room probably made at different points in time, which is that in the heyday of sovereign bond issues, many people would be warning about beware of repricing risk and beware of rollover risk. And this is not a poison chalice, but it's a double-edged sword might be a better image. And I think what we've learned with a vengeance from the chart I had up a couple of minutes ago is indeed concerns about volatility of access and about spreads are not theoretical. We've just seen it happen. Let me pause there and pass over to Stefania. Thank you.
Okay, the second section of the report examines macroeconomic and financial vulnerabilities in low-income developing countries. And we are also looking at longer-term vulnerability, and in particular the ones stemming from natural disasters and climate change. Macroeconomic vulnerability are analyzed in the report through a number of lenses. The first one, we assess vulnerability through the length of a statistical methodology that assesses the likelihood of low-income country having a drop in growth and in economic growth. And the methodology involves estimation of an index, the growth decline index, that links the likelihood of experiencing a sharp drop to a number of economic and structural variables. The methodology takes into account historical relations and between growth declines and economic, structural, and again fiscal sector and external sector indicators. The index allowed us to categorize countries like a low, medium, and high risk of experiencing a drop in growth. And again, this is an index is a statistical tools that we hope to further refine over time, but is an indicator that gives us a good sense of how things are changing, how vulnerability change over time. The second indicator that we are looking at is we are making use of the IMF database on the debt sustainability assessment that are run every year, typically on a low-income developing country, which provide a forward-looking assessment of the risk of encounter external debt distress. And the third lens is a look at the financial sector vulnerabilities, and this mainly focus on the frontier low-income country, the one that have more financial sector open, developed. And so let me start with the vulnerability to a growth shock. And on the left-hand side panel, we see the growth decline vulnerability index. So the story here is basically, the situation is quite striking. Over the last 2 years, in particular, we see that the indicators suggest that 40% of the countries are deemed a high risk. And this is a level that has not been experienced since the global crisis. In terms of the vulnerability, we see that the commodity exporters have been the one that hit hardest. But despite the good outcome that Sean pointed out for the more diversified exporter, those are also not really spared. It's a broader increase in vulnerability that we see. And in terms of channel, or the sector that exposed most to the vulnerability, commodity is really the external sector, while for the more diversified exporters is the fiscal sector. Looking at the debt sustainability assessment, again, this is an exercise that is done jointly with the World Bank. We can see that, helped by debt relief and strong growth, the number of countries had a high risk of debt distress has declined since let's say from the crisis level up to 2014. But then there is like a turning point where there's been an increase in country, and we have had like 11 downgrading and 5 upgrading in 2015. Now, for the analysis of before 2014, I would refer to a recent World Bank IMF paper on the public debt vulnerability in low-income countries. They analyzed in detail the trends. But I would like to focus exactly on the last period. And among the downgraded, we have countries like Ethiopia, Republic of Congo, for example, Madagascar, Zambia. They moved to low moderate risk, and or country like Mauritania, Mongolia, they moved to high risk. But what is in common that most cases reflect the high borrowing levels that brought the country to move to higher risks. In terms of the downgraded, the upgraded, we have countries like Nepal, Haiti, but those are really, the lower risk are mainly due to methodology, because in DSA we have changed in 2013 the discount rate from 3 to 5, so it's more a technical feature. So indication are that over the last 1-2 years, also from the debt sustainability, from the debt distress point of view, vulnerability seems to have mounted. So moving to the financial vulnerabilities, this is the third aspect of the analysis. We look mostly at the frontier markets, economies, and we make use of 2 tools. One is the Financial Vulnerability Index. Again, it draws on econometric analysis, this index, and it's mainly analyzed 5 aspects. It's built on 5 aspects. The domestic one is the foreign liabilities to domestic credit. Then we look at the credit to GDP ratios, the capital adequacy, return on assets, and the ratio of bank loans to deposit. In this analysis, what we see is that since the onset of the crisis, vulnerability have abated, but still half of the countries are at a risk, mainly stemming from the growth expansion, the credit growth, and the foreign denomination of the loan. Again, this indicator is not a sign of immediate crisis. This is more flagging that there are vulnerabilities that need to be watched out in the sector. The other indicator, we use the Z-score methodology, and this mainly observation. They look how the observation deviate from historical means of a variable. And we see that the one closer to the center indicate lower risk, and more of the points goes towards the external, increase the risk. So here we see that return on assets since 2010, return on assets have declined. And the other 2 areas where we see vulnerability mounting are in the credit to deposit and the cross-border lending. Now, moving to, I would like to touch upon quickly to this one. This we also do some shock scenarios analysis in the report, and the methodology allows for an assessment of the adequacy of external buffer, what we call, and of the fiscal positions in the aftermath of global shocks. So scenarios, once one understands the nature and the scale of the shocks, don't give really surprises, but they are also useful another tool to look at the vulnerability. So we in this report ran 2 scenarios. They are in line with the WIO, and the Global Financial Stability reports. And I would like to focus on this one, where we consider the impact of protected financial volatility. And the scenario, it's implies a delay in the monetary policy normalization and limit the economic risk-taking worldwide. So this would have an impact at the global level in output and would further push down the prices of commodities. So what we see here that low-income country would be again penalized, and temporarily the one that are hit most are the commodity exporters, and with a substantive hit on their fiscal position and external position. Again, there are not major surprises in these scenarios. So let me move to the longer-term risk, and in particular, the risk associated to natural disasters. Everybody talks about the vulnerability from climate change links. The low-income countries are the ones that are more exposed. So we wanted to just have a closer look to this. And here we see that, for example, in this chart, that over the last 10 years, LIDCs have really experienced a much higher hit from natural disaster, and it is about 1.5 times more than higher income country. And if we look at risk, we see drawing on changes of climate parameter projected for the next 30 years, projected by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Here, these are data for Macroeconomic. They build this index. They give us an indication, capture the frequency intensity of extreme climate event. And we see that 80% of the low-income country, developing country, are at higher risk compared to 50% for higher income country. So the key messages are basically reinforcing what Sean has really pointed out, with the additional element on the climate change that indicate that now is the time for this country to build resilience and think a policy that to build their policy in a way that includes elements that allow to identify and adaptation, assessment, self-insurance, and so on. And we have countries already like Cambodia, Bangladesh, Nepal that have started this effort by incorporating all climate-related spending into their macro frameworks. So let me move to the last section of the report on private capital inflows. So in this chapter, we look at capital inflows and the development in these countries, how and here we see that the capital inflows have really grown faster in mainly two ways. From 2004, and then there's been a dip at around the financial crisis, and then they have picked up. And they increased barely at around from 2% of GDP in 2004, they got up to more than 6% in 2012. Now, the composition has also changed over time. We see that at the beginning of the 2000s, it was mainly foreign direct investment, and then later on, more recently, portfolio debt and equity inflows have also increased. The leading country in this is really a handful of low-income developing countries that are the drivers of this uptick. And these are countries that represent the fast-growing country, and we see the country that have liberalized at the level of, they have liberalized their capital accounts at the level of, at least at the jure, at the level of emerging market. Clearly, these numbers mask differences, important differences. We have countries like Bolivia, for example, they have always had a moderate open capital accounts, and countries like Ghana or New Guinea. I cannot remember right now, but there is another country that really done fast opening the capital account. Another country like Mozambique, Tanzania, they've been modestly closed. So in the report, we also analyzed these are important funds that the country receive, where the funds go. And in our analysis, this is done on 41 countries. We see that inflows are highly correlated with both investment, but also consumption. And 1%, for example, in capital inflows, we estimate that 1% increase in capital inflow goes at about 0.25 percentage points go in investment, increase in investment, and about a tenth of a percentage point go to consumption. So clearly, this has to keep in mind that if capital flows goes to productive, a channel to productive sector of the economy, clearly there is a difference if they goes only to consumption, because that needs to be watched out for a pile-up of debt. And here we see just two examples. I go quickly. For example, Ghana, we see the sovereign borrowing has really popped up over the years, but the trends in investment have not really kept up with that. And the case of Mongolia, they had a large issue in 2012. It's like 20% of GDP. And that has stimulated investment, but not at the level of the. At the same time, we have to really watch out in terms of the debt, because that, for example, the debt in Mongolia has passed from 40% to 90% in 3 years. So the last part, I just want to, we look at how capital flows are responsive to economic and global financial condition, and we see that this is a chart of the spread around the 2013, the tantrum when the taper that the Federal Reserve did, and when they announced the possibility of faster normalization, and we see how spread have responded in this country. So clearly, capital inflows are responsive. The access and the cost is a response to global condition out there. But the good news that they respond also from our analysis to domestic conditions. So strong fundamental positions and good debt management are really critical here. So this mainly point out to that, the country have to take into account the double-edged nature of capital inflows. So with this, I would pass it to Sean again.
That's the coverage of what's in the report. A lot of it is in more detail than we presented it. I think we've kind of just tried to touch on to give you a flavor of what's there. I'd like to use the remaining period of time that we have to just discuss briefly the role, what the IMF is committed to in the context of financing for development and the SDGs. There's a couple of key papers in this regard, which are the references to them are actually, I'll just flick through this. I think you all know SDGs, Addis, Paris, etc., and the UN in September. But I wanted just to flag what we committed to do. What we did was we looked at through IMF operations through an FFT lens, and said, what, there's a whole lot of things we do that are directly linked. I mean, global financial stability, for example. Probably in Monterey, people didn't think it was a big deal, but we can't time to think of it as a pretty big deal now. It's kind of core business for the fund. But we focused. I'm focusing here on what we said we were going to do more of. The first one was that we were going to expand our access to our lending facilities for low-income countries, our concessional zero-interest rate facilities, which we did in July by 50%. The second thing we've committed to, and this was a big theme in Addis, for anyone who was there, was is to expand our support for DRM, for domestic revenue mobilization. We spend about a quarter of the IMF budgets on technical assistance. 20% of that goes actually to assistance in the area of tax policy and administration. And there we intend to and are committed to expanding the amount of TA we deliver on the ground, either from Washington or through our regional technical assistance centres, but also, and this is an important one, to deepen our work on international tax issues of relevance for developing countries. A theme that emerged in ADIS was a sense, certainly among many developing countries, that they were being left out of the international tax policy debate, the BEPS debate, and so forth. And we've done work on issues like international tax spillovers, which have actually been quite striking. So this we see as a truly important area that we can actually add value. Infrastructure is a big theme in the FFD agenda. It's not core business for the IMF. This is very much the MDB territory. In a sense, the billions to trillions narrative that many of you heard a lot about was all about trying to use funding to, particularly ODA, and to try and leverage additional private investment in infrastructure, for example. I'm not sure that much has happened in that area yet. That in terms of spelling out the templates and the kind of models that will be needed to attract private investment into infrastructure in low-income countries. But that's an area that remains to be tackled. We are looking in more narrowly at issues of investment management capacity, debt sustainability analysis, investment growth analysis, stuff that we actually do that is part of the areas of expertise. As I said, project stuff we've no strong expertise in. We've made a commitment on fragile states work and on small developing countries. The message on fragile states has been, we spent a lot of time on fragile states back 2011-12 seeking to learn what I would call the basic lessons. The idea of sort of being sensitive, recognizing fragile states are different. It sounds like a really dumb, really simple point, but actually a lot of people fail to fully internalize that fact. You need to spend much more time focused on income distribution issues, on awareness to distribution, on demobilization, youth unemployment, etc. What we've learned from our most recent work in the area is the need to reorient TA, our technical assistance, and that of others, which we do jointly, much more towards medium-term focus on institution building. No expectation of immediate rates of, rapid returns, rapid changes. Rather a hard slog of building core government institutions, rebuilding, I should say, in most cases post-conflict. So that's an area where, again, part of our technical assistance and our engagement with donors, that's something we attach a lot of importance to. On small developing countries, that's very much a climate change agenda issue as well, because the idea here is to say we're not doing enough work in taking account of the macroeconomics of natural disasters, which are, if you think of the Caribbean, for example, are center stage in terms of frequency. We need to rethink the macro of that. We need to work with others to work out how to help, thinking that climate change is going to make all these problems worse. Working with other agencies, both to sort of develop disaster preparedness, also using financial instruments to sort of build in, to provide buffers, as well as one's own buffers, such as foreign reserves, and finally to access climate change, access climate finance, which is an area that's a complete puzzle to small states at the moment. And it's not an area we'll be providing much money in, but this is where the MDVs have promised a very large amount of funding. And I mentioned two other areas there, which I think others at the table know much more about than I do. One was a focus on developing domestic financial markets, mainly in terms of developing new diagnostic tools and expanding our technical assistance in the area. To be very candid, a lot of IMF resources in the financial sector area since 2009-10 were redirected to the systemically important sort of top 20 countries, where we went into cycles of doing financial sector assessments every 5 years, for example. And the logic behind this is you don't need to explain it, but within the context of zero real growth budget environment means actually that there's been displacement and we need to reorient our work. And lastly is the effort to integrate much more effectively issues of equity and inclusion into both our surveillance and our analytical work, but our surveillance and program work as well. We've begun a lot of pilot initiatives in these areas. We've done about work in 10 countries on 10, 12 countries on gender, and about 11, 12 on inequality. There, though, we need to learn a lot more. We need to be borrowing more knowledge and advice from the World Bank, and it would be an agency that would come to mind. So these are the kind of things we really committed on FFD. On climate change, I'm going to go across it really fast, but in essence, it's continue the kind of advocacy work we've been doing on energy pricing reform, including appropriate energy taxation to factor in the negative externalities. Secondly, technical assistance and support for implementing different forms of carbon pricing. Thirdly is the work stream kicked off in a sense by Mark Carney in that pre-Lima last year, with his articulation of the need to really bring in green considerations into financial sector prudential analysis and stress testing and stuff, not because it was a good thing, but because it was actually an increasing threat to a longer-term threat to financial sectors. Certainly was an idea that we brought in, the idea of assets that would know, such as much of the oil in the ground that might not actually be usable as stranded assets, is a very important concept. And the last area is the area of working on natural disaster risks in a macro framework, as I mentioned, feeding back into initially beginning with our work in small states. So that's what we've said we'll do. And as I said, I urge you over time to ask us, what have you done? Because it's always, organizations have lots of pressures on them. And the more pressures there are in this area, I say as somebody committed to working on developing issues, the better. Thank you very much indeed, Julie.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you very much. So, Sean, Stefano, thank you very much for your comments. Just to summarise a little bit, I think some of the main points that came over was about, of course, the major impact of oil prices, but also the diversity of situations for non-oil exporters, and the importance of different types of policy response in how well they're fared in the current environment. Also, both of you emphasised the rising, not a sort of crisis, but a rising vulnerability in LICs, and the need for us to be focused on policy responses that help LICs and that let them help themselves. We mentioned some of the things there, but of course fiscal management, absolutely critical, debt and credit growth, their vulnerability to climate change, and the importance of understanding sort of double-edged sword impact of capital flows, particularly from international investors. IMF's role in tackling some of that, of course, access to finance. It's a bit of a basic one from the IMF, but I think we should absolutely remember its importance, including historically, where it's repeatedly supported countries in terms of responses to various problems. Some of the other new ideas: domestic resource, of course, international taxation, a topic of interest to many countries. The importance of building institutions and financial markets, including domestic markets, and then specific forms of financing for some of the key needs for LICs, particularly infrastructure and climate adaptation. So thank you very much. Let me hand over to the discussants. I'm going to keep you very strictly to the 7 minutes, so we do have time for some questions. I mean, maybe I could ask you to go first, and then I'll ask Liz to talk about this, please.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much. I really learned a lot from the report because it's so comprehensive, intensively done, and extensive as well because it covered all low-income developing countries in the world. But my main takeaway from the report is that the macroeconomic positions of these countries have weakened. And then I looked at the sources of these weaknesses, which I can categorize into two, external and internal. Now, the external mainly is due to the collapse of the global commodity prices, and then the internal, which is also associated with the first one, which is external, is the fiscal space of the countries that are dependent on these exports. So what I will do is I will talk on three broad subtopics: macroeconomics of commodity price boom and bust cycles. Then I will talk a bit on fiscal deficits, and then on external finance. The main, in theory, the main discussions or the main work that tries to explain what is the behavior, how do we expect prices of commodity to behave over time, is not a new thing in the literature. It started with the work of Prebisch, Singer, later on became the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, and later on our Arthur Lewis, the Manchester Nobel laureate, also came up with another theory. But the Prebisch-Singer is probably more popular than the Lewis one, where it says that the prices of commodity may tend to have a downward trending. So this is like telling the developing countries that are dependent on commodities that your exports that is dependent on commodity is not very much dependable for development reasons. So then there is a lot of debate within the cycle of academics, and they wanted to test that. So a lot of papers try to do that, which I will talk about it later. Now, Lewis, on the other side, was saying, no, he doesn't think that the prices are going to be downward trending, but rather it will be somewhat constant. So there is no trend at all. It will keep on like that. Not that it will not go up and down, but if you average the minus and the negatives, they will all now become equals to zero. So I looked at the empirical evidence of both these two. They are somewhat mixed. So you find some saying, yeah, there is evidence for the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, prices tend to go downward. And others say, no, they did not find any evidence for that. The recent paper I found was incidentally from IMF by Areski et al., 2013, and later on published in Journal of International Money and Finance, 2014, where they said there is somewhat most of in the data set they covered, there is a lot of evidence pointing towards that of Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. But Easterly is the only one I found out that saying he doesn't find any evidence of that. So he thinks that exports of commodities are still persistent. So anyway, the bottom line is that we know that the booms and bust cycle of commodity prices is there, and there has been a lot of attempt to explain that. And the only difference with the current one is the fact that this current one probably is not a cycle. It's going to stay for some time, as we heard from Sean. And fundamentally because the structure of demand and supply is also changing. So the countries needed to brace up for that. And then secondly, on the very quickly, on the fiscal policy, there is also a relationship between external sector and the fiscal policy, which later on come to be known as twin deficit. So it's not surprising that we found from the report that when the external sector deteriorated, so it's also affected the fiscal policy. The external funding, there was a lot of argument during the financial crisis that the developing countries more or less escaped somewhat from the financial crisis. But suddenly, the explanation then was that FDI constituted most of the capital flows into those countries. However, if you look at from the report, the portfolios have also started becoming more significant, particularly after the financial crisis. And portfolio, again, with the experience of what had happened in the East Asian crisis of the 1990s, they are the ones that are very much susceptible to sudden stop and even reversal. So they could be, these countries have to be very careful with them and find a very good policy to handle that. Then on the policy, Sean has mentioned that, there was a lot of effort to build up a buffer, like the Nigerian case, reserve was built, and after a while, the reserve gone away. So there is also now need probably to improve the transparency in terms of institutions. So the institutional strengthening should be there, because the Nigerian case is the second time. They had the first one early 1990s. After the first Gulf War, they were able to put that one in what they call extra something account, but that one got missing completely because it was under military and nothing happened. So there is now need to make it more transparent. And finally, IMF has already identified and understood because this is not about the debt burden that this may bring to these countries. And my only kind of suggestion here, they just need to be aware. Well, they are aware because they now knew what had happened when they started working on highly dated countries and help them in getting out of it. So just to avoid the repeat. And on the report, there is only one or two elements that I thought probably the report might have overlooked. That is the role of migrant remittances. They are becoming very, very important now. And then they may also have, because if they are very important to countries like some that remittance now account for a significant part of their foreign exchange, it may also constitute a macroeconomic problem in how to handle. Sorry, I have overshot.
Thank you. So some of the points there, I think a very interesting point you make about the fact that commodity revenues are maybe an unreliable source of financing for development over the long term, given boom-bust cycles, but also you're suggesting, or I guess we'll see next year, that the structural change in the oil price that may or may not be long-term or short-term. And perhaps the importance of fiscal management as well. You mentioned some of the ideas around policy about buffers and transparency, which of course are being widely debated, and the role of remittances, I think, is a very interesting topic as well, of course, especially about international economics. Liz, over to you. I will be handing you the 3 and 1 minute notices.
Right.
Off you go.
Thanks very much. And thank you to Stefania and Sean so much for the presentation. I'm going to give more of a kind of a normative sort of response, which is talking to the IMF's role on the 2030 development agenda to the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, I'm going to present a sort of pre-written blog for you. I'm going to read out my 10 things the IMF should do, of which, by my scoring, I think you're already on track to do, or you're planning to do, about half of them. I may have cut the cake slightly differently from you, but there may be some additional requests of you. But before that, I'd like to state just how valuable I think this both intellectual and sort of policy exercise that you've done and that the fund has been doing for a couple of years, which is looking specifically at the growth potential and the threats and potential shocks for the LIDCs. I know that low-income country analysis was actually under threat at the fund a couple of years ago, and it's fantastically important that this work is carrying on. And I think there's been a validation of the fund's decision, your decision to sort of separate countries out into these different groupings of commodity exporters, diversified exporters. As we see the variation in responses of these countries, I think it's validated that choice. So I think it's really important to underline how valuable this analysis is. But let me run you quickly through my spoken blog. So 10 things that the fund should be doing to respond to the SDG agenda. Well, the first one, tick, you say you're going to be doing, which is expanding access to concessional finance. I mean, clearly this isn't going to be the prime funding mechanism for developing countries who want to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's a very important stopgap, precautionary function, something that's very important for developing countries to know that's there. The second point is, albeit with the caveats that Stefania, you set out, that I think there's a clear case for the fund to be a little bit more flexible in its approach to debt sustainability.
I mean, clearly we know that countries aren't going to be able to fund the SDGs at the moment. ODI research shows that the tax capacity of the world's poorest countries falls very far short from the scale of public investment that's required. So there's an $84 billion annual financing gap just for social services and social protection alone. Some countries are very close to their debt to GDP ratio, like Kenya, and I think there's going to be some more consideration of flexibility is going to be necessary. Number 3, talking about being flexible, it's important that the fund continues to be flexible in its approach to countries that are trying to spend more on, health and education systems, as has been the case with the fund in more recent years. But I think particularly the leave no one behind agenda of the SDGs, which is the emphasis on the bottom quintile and marginalised groups, is going to require that increased and continued flexibility. Number 4, this seems like a different era. You talk about the 20th century being a 20th century man, sure. The fund used to do something it called Gleneagles scenarios, which was, let's just imagine that all the donors actually delivered all the ODA that they said they were going to deliver. What would this mean for the absorptive capacity for various countries? Now, clearly we're in a very different era, and I don't think absorptive capacity is any longer the problem, but I think this is a 15-year ambitious agenda. It would be helpful and useful for the fund to be thinking about sort of maximalist inflows into countries and what that might look like, rather than just thinking about external financing sources that are available today. And then number 5, you get a tick for this as well, I think, which is technical assistance in target setting. Countries are going to go through the exercise of setting their own sort of domestic SDG targets, and I think done carefully, so that without creating the impression of an outsider coming in and telling countries what to do. I'm sure countries would find it very valuable with some of the technical aspects of that target setting. The next 2 are all around sort of the fund's role in the monitoring and the follow-up of the SDGs. My next 2 are perhaps the most sort of radical proposals, if you like. And the first one is, I think the fund, so number 6, the fund needs to be participating as a formal member, not just as a UN agency, which it is technically, but as a key intergovernmental agency in the follow-up and review process. So in the high-level political forum, which is the mechanism for follow-up and review of the SDGs, I think the fund should be reporting its contribution to countries' achievement of particularly Goal 8, which is the economic growth, broadly jobs goal. I know that will be a controversial suggestion, but let's see how that lands. Number 7, you get a half tick for, I think, in which you've identified that you'd like to do more with helping countries deliver on the inequality agenda. I think something specific you could do in your surveillance is including a metric on income inequality in the Article 4 surveillance, in the sort of country reporting mechanism. That would, A, signal that this is a macro-critical issue, but B, it sends a very important political signal to finance ministers. The fund takes this seriously, and this is something to be delivered on. So whether it's the Gini or the Palmer index, whichever metric is chosen. Number 8, a tick again. So continue to contribute to technical assistance particularly on taxation systems, but also on sort of how you design social protection systems and finance those. I think would be really useful. And then the last 2 is a sort of advocacy role for the fund, which I think some parts of the fund are more comfortable with than others. So number 9 would be resident representatives kind of talking about the SDGs whenever possible in national context, and making sure the fund is at these stakeholder dialogues when countries are starting to do outreach on what their national development targets should look like within the context of the SDGs. And then finally, in my gallop through, a sort of broader framing piece on advocacy. So, for a long time, there's been a sort of, there's been a perceived loggerhead between sort of macroeconomic growth and sort of some of the social sectors and investing in social sectors, and a sort of disagreement about whether you really are investing in productive capacity if you're spending money on, doctors' salaries or building hospitals or schools. And I think the fund has gone a long way to sort of starting to bring those 2 communities together And I think that needs to continue. And for instance, the role that the managing director, Christine Lagarde, has, that was recently announced at Davos, she's going to be one of the members of the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. That's the kind of thing I think the fund can carry on doing in a very useful way. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I guess the main points there, one was about the financing and the fact that realistically, perhaps, even if we have domestic resource mobilisation and improved taxation, there's still a need for financing in maybe in a realistic context. And the other, some of the points you made around the role for the IMF in terms of setting and following up SDGs, but also advocacy and bringing it to the top of the agenda, both nationally and internationally. Yeah, thanks. Let me take a few questions. There's a little short of time. I'll take groups of 3 questions. I hope we'll have at least 2 or 3 rounds, and then I'll also ask Sean and Stefania to respond to the discussants' comments as well at the same time. Can I ask you to keep questions brief so that everyone can have a chip in, given that we're running a little short?